to welcome you to this session because we have our very own Professor Mandakini Dubey with us. And for those of you who don't know, she teaches literary theory and the survey course, Literature in the Age of Empire, along with a host of electives about 19th century literature. Today, she's going to speak to us about a talk titled Original Oriental, and I'm going to pass the baton to her without further ado. Professor Dubey, all yours.
Thank you, Vignesh. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And actually, I should say thank you also um, to Epigraph for doing this series. I think that during this pandemic and just the lockdown, it's been wonderful that you've been able to keep the conversation going, in a sense, to open up the lockdown. And it's lovely to be with you. So I actually can't see very much on the screen. If you could bring up the presentation, we can begin, I think.
Yes, Professor, I'm sharing the screen.
Thank you. I should just begin by saying maybe a little bit about what brings me to this topic. I think that, to be quite honest, it's probably quite personal. Um, you know, in a sense, growing up as somebody who loved reading English literature, who began to speak, think, dream in English, I always felt that I was kept a little distant from the experiences of, an understanding of religion and of Indian languages, because I was looking through a very thick pane of glass almost at at these experiences. And so it made me think about uh, the question of authenticity, of being able to inhabit um, a more, unmediated relation with these texts and with these experiences. And I think I've been trying to investigate that, and that's probably what led me to an interest in looking at colonial discourse. So today we're going to be talking about, well, I think I might as well give it away. It's a kind of pseudo translation. And in thinking about the pseudo translation, it's a text called the Kasîdah. I'm hoping that we can come to slightly less somber and alienating ideas about authenticity, about being able to inhabit that relationship with reality. So as you'll see, the text that I'm talking about is called the Kasîdah, and it'll take me a little while to get to it. My talk is entitled Original Oriental, because the only language I could figure out that this poem was written in, this alleged Sufi poem, is the language we might call Oriental. It's nothing else. But if we could go to the next slide, thank you. When we think about the word Oriental, uh, particularly since the late 1970s, I think we were very aware of the idea that that the notion of the Orient is one that's produced in a kind of unequal power relation, that a lot of the disciplines, the scholarly disciplines that sought to understand the languages of the so-called Orient, the religions of the so-called Orient, um, a lot of that scholarship was undertaken, as Edward Said told us in his sort of groundbreaking post-colonial text, Orientalism. A lot of that was undertaken in sort of hand in glove with the task of colonial administration. And in some sense, the way that we often think about the relation of power and literature, even today, often in class, for example, we'll have conversations and people will wonder why it is that we're reading these texts. Why are we still looking back at a history which emerges out of an unfair relation of privilege, etc. And I'm hoping that in thinking about this apocryphal translation, we'll be able to come to a somewhat more muddy and therefore a little bit more of an interesting understanding of that transaction. In any case, for Said, the clearest statement of his view is that knowledge of the Orient through such disciplines as comparative language, so or philology or comparative religion, because it is generated out of strength, in a sense, creates the Orient, the Oriental, and his world. Okay, so we'll forgive him that universal male pronoun. And we will now maybe consider whether the taken for granted position from which this construction is happening is one that stays intact even as we begin to read more closely. So let's go forward. Thank you, Vignesh. In particular, Said was talking about Islam and about the Oriental the Orientalist construction of Islam. And of course, the history of Europe's relationship with Islam is very old. It's probably as old as Islam itself. And you know this because you can think of the way that Greek philosophers interacted with the Islamic world. You can think of, the fact that Islam was practiced in a widespread way in Spain all the way to the 16th or 17th centuries. Um, but I'm thinking about the context for today's talk is uh, 18th century, 19th century, sort of the mania for Islam that developed. Uh, Maybe the easiest way to think about it is with the translation of the Arabian Nights Tales by Antoine Galland in the early 18th century. And Galland's was the first of many influential translations of the tales. And some of you have probably studied this in a course like Forms of Literature. And so you'll remember that each translator sort of brought a new version of the Arabian Nights Tales into focus. And you have, the idea of, I'll be talking a little bit further along about Richard Burton, for instance, who produced a very scandalous translation of the Arabian Nights Tales. And a similarly influential text was and I believe that different versions through the 19th century. And maybe you could say of writer in the 19th century produced a version of the Quran in Europe. And another very important sort of way station in this history is the first Persian grammar in English by Sir William Jones, who would later be called Asiatic Jones because he started the Asiatic Society. And, about 13 years after he produced this Persian grammar, while he was working as a judge in Calcutta, he came up with the theory of a shared origin of languages. He wasn't the first, but he was the most influential to come up with that idea that uh, that languages as distinct as German, English, Persian, and Hindustani might have had a shared origin, which is now called Proto-Indo-European. And the funny thing about that, if you look at the frontispiece of this first Persian grammar in English, which also contained a translation of a Persian, it's called a Persian song, a translation of Hafiz. And it says, it says so by Sir William Jones, but it also gives us a different nom de plume, which is Jones Oxfordi, Jones of Oxford. So he was already something of a translated man. And these look like, fairly dry academic affairs. But you can see now in the next slide that this sort of led to, it wasn't something that remained merely a matter of scholarship. So Vignesh, if we could go forward. Thank you. I'm not going to go through each of these instances, but many of the texts that I've mentioned here play with translation in an interesting way. For example, Persian Letters from 1721 is, I suppose you could call it an epistolary novel of sorts. It sort of follows these two Persian nobles as they are traveling through France, and they're writing these letters, which are allegedly translations of Persian texts, in which they're talking about, what social life is like. It becomes a kind of um, a thin vehicle, a thin excuse, a kind of vehicle through which to talk about European life. Similarly, Voltaire wrote a play on Muhammad, which you can see it's called Of Fanaticism. So it becomes a way for him to talk about fanaticism, not only in relation to Muhammad, whom he, entirely defines in those terms, but also more generally, fanaticism in Europe, in France. Um, and and interestingly, about, I guess, 19 years later, in 1800, Goethe, who was, a towering figure at this point, and is often thought to be the person who inaugurated the idea of world literature. He translated Voltaire's play and staged it, except he dropped the bit about fanaticism. Suddenly, in his rendering, Muhammad becomes this kind of intense romantic seeker, and that becomes also a way for him to try out a new style of writing. Um, and and we can go on. It's not just the French and the Germans who are doing this. Some of the most familiar romantic poets in English, like Byron and Shelley, also took up some of these themes, brought them into their own poetry. Shelley's The Revolt of Islam is, not only about Islam as such. And it gets to the point where Goethe is not simply writing about Muhammad from a distance. He himself started writing this compendium of poems, which you can see the frontispiece there, which is called the West Eastern Divan, Divan being a collection of poems. And he is inspired by his reading of Hafiz, his translation of Hafiz, the classical Persian poet. But you'll see also that in calling it the West Eastern Divan, he's maintaining a kind of distinction between the West and the East. And if you were to look, well, maybe we can move to the next slide. This is actually, these are some pictures of a memorial in Weimar, which was built, well, it's not as ancient as the other things I'm talking about. This is from the turn of this century, from about 2000, I think. And this is a memorial to Hafiz and Goethe, and you can see there's a kind of fun at play here, because you look at those two, the memorial itself, it presents the sculpture of these two stately thrones facing each other. It looks like a kind of political summit without, Gorbachev and Reagan present. And the pun I'm talking about is the fact that they're taking the idea of the divan, which is a compendium of poems, and literalizing it as pieces of furniture, which I think is, I'm hoping, is a stroke of wit. And so it's kind of very stark, and east and west, the twain shall not meet in this sculpture. But the base of it has, as you'll see from the detail in these photographs, it is, it's filled with carvings. There's inscriptions of poems by Hafiz, and then surrounding that are some of the German translations. And if you were to look at the legend below, which you can't really see, but it again talks about the Orient and the Occident. So a kind of, visual material representation of one way of thinking about that relationship. So, Dignesh, please. Um, in any case, so you'll see that one of the most familiar ways in which Islam was uh, entering not just the homes but also the minds, and the pens, of some of these writers and thinkers, and then of their readers, was through Persian poetry, and through that there was a kind of familiarity to this idea of sensual excess, of um, aesthetic transport, and through that aesthetic transport of a kind of mystical union with the beloved, namely with God, which was quite familiar from Persian poetry, much of which is impelled by a kind of Sufi spirit, right? Sufi being Islamic mysticism. Um, and I think many of you will probably be more familiar than I am with some of this, because as I was saying in my sad introduction, I don't have the same access to ghazals and so on, that because I didn't grow up with them. I was too busy reading, Jane Eyre or whatever. So I think that for you, these themes would be quite familiar, those of you who grew up in North India at least. But let's turn back to Asiatic Jones in 1792, where he's trying to think about Sufism and where it came from. And I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to be wandering as I get to the alleged case of the Kasîdah. I'm going to be going through some of these mazy bylanes and flipping through some dusty books and picking up too many quotations. So do forgive me for that. In this particular quotation, you'll see that Jones is trying to think about how this mysticism of Sufi poetry that he encountered, that he translated, how does that square with his own understanding of Islam, which was, as something which had something to do with, that which had a very particular concrete relation with the Semitic religion, its particular way of being, fanaticism, etc., etc. And the answer that he came to was that modern Sufis, if you look at the fourth line of that quotation, it says modern Sufis seem to have borrowed it from the Indian philosophers of the Vedanta school. And their doctrines are also believed to be the source of that sublime theology which sparkles in the writings of the old academics. So he's saying that actually Greek philosophy drew from Vedanta via Sufism. And Sufism he links to Vedanta. So this was a theme that would, constantly show up in the writings of Orientalists thinking about Sufism, which was a theme that Sufism is a kind of pantheistic, heterodox, non-Islamic strain within Islam. And therefore, it obviously has to have something to do with, maybe Vedanta or Buddhism, something that is not Muslim, not Islamic. And let's move on to a few of the other ways of thinking about Sufism that were prevalent at this time. You'll see that many of them have more to do with a sense of what the self is than with, you'll see a lot of, I suppose you'll see a lot of strains of fantasy and just, I guess, identification in some of these descriptions. So in one talk in 1811, the philologist and Orientalist J.W. Graham sort of tries to square, and he's taking these ideas that he's encountering these texts, and he's saying, well, I could maybe try and understand it in terms of the Holy Trinity, which is more familiar to me. And so you'll see in that first quotation that he sees that Mehboob is the Son, Muhabbat is the Holy Ghost, and Muhib is the Father. Evidently, I love that evidently. A little later, August Toluk, who's a German translator and philologist, he in his text, he actually wrote the first book on the first sort of monograph on Sufism in 1821. And in that, he goes wandering all over the place. First, he talks about how Sufism must have come from here, there, and everywhere. But then he kind of goes back to the idea that maybe it was actually not an import from another religion, but illustrated and generated out of Muhammad's own mysticism. So you can see a lot of kind of confusion about where did this come from. And in his translation of a dictionary of Sufi terms in 1845, and this is why I say that there's a lot of fantasy and identification or disidentification involved, because Alois Sprenger says he describes Sufism as a monomania and a disease, right? So he says a dictionary of the technical language of the Sufis is interesting for the friend of Persian Islamic literature. Why? Because the diseases of nations are the most important part of their life. So on the one hand, you have somebody who thinks that Sufism is just like Christianity. On the other hand, you have that arm's length or longer than arm's length distancing in Sprenger's description of it as a disease of Islam. And I'm afraid I'm going to take you trawling through some more quotations on the next slide. Okay, I'll skip to the second one first, which is E.H. Palmer in his book Oriental Mysticism in 1867, when he goes back to kind of the hint in um, Yunus Uxfardi's telling, which is when he says that maybe Sufism is really the development of the primeval religion of the Aryan race. So there's a nice mix up of religion and race there, which in turn is linked to language because people were talking at this point about the Aryan school of languages as well. And we return to Richard F. Burton, Richard Francis Burton is his name, who talks about the fact that this has all become very familiar. He says that these days, the literati of Europe are as learned in the tenets of Tasawwuf or Sufism as most of the Maulvis. So how's that for a sense of authority? Anyway, I guess what we're looking at is a strange brew of associations and ideas. And I want to focus a little bit on that quotation from Garcin de Tassy in 1857, an important year, of course. But in this case, he says, placed between the pantheism of the Indian yogis and the Quran. So again, trying to understand how does this seemingly free-spirited, pantheistic, heterodox strain within Islam, how did that come into being? It obviously has something to do with India, but maybe it is also something to do with a more familiar version of spirituality. He says, the Quran, which is sometimes an informal copy of the Bible, their philosophers, namely the Sufis, have established a pantheistic school appropriate to Islam ideas, a sort of esoteric doctrine of Islamism. That's an interesting word, esoteric. If you think about it, association of the word esoteric is that which is recondite, secretive, hidden from us, something that you have to kind of read between the lines to get, that a text might have an exoteric front, but that certain people are initiated into being able to grasp the secret truth of it. And in some sense, this fits in with the fact that the 19th century is a time when there's a great interest in esoteric religion. The fact that maybe it's a version of the idea that all languages could have originally had the same shared root. Here, the idea is that maybe all religions have within them a secret shared kind of mystical religion, and that would be a kind of esoteric Kabbalah, right? So keeping that word in mind, if we could just move on, we go back to Said. And I've just been talking about the ways in which all these translators have sought to define quite authoritatively what Sufism is. And it really goes along with Said's understanding of the politics of translation, of philology at this point. And he sees it, he's talking about a particular French philologist at this point, and he sees in him, look at some of those words on the screen in front of you. He says, it's a picture of a learned Westerner surveying and explaining, articulating the passive seminal, feminine, even silent and supine East. So the East is passive. It's like somebody lying on a couch, but not speaking to the analyst. The analyst doesn't even need the East to speak, because here this learned Westerner is making the Orient deliver up its secrets under the learned authority of a philologist whose power derives from the ability to unlock secret esoteric languages. So here these languages, they exist, and look at the kind of idea of reading that's involved here. That in the text, there's something, a kernel at the heart of the text. It's secret, it's locked, it's esoteric, and somebody needs to have the authority to break it open and access it. And that somebody is, of course, going to be a European translator. So thinking about that word, let's actually go on to a different way of using that word. And I'm going back to Richard Burton. So Richard Burton, his version of his translation of the Book of a Thousand Nights and a Night, it's a multi-volume text. It's written in a kind of, it's a fairly, clumsy, style, you can't let go of your awareness of the style because it's very ornate. Um, and it is also festooned with notes. I mean, there's huge numbers of notes. And in fact, um, there's a terminal essay about it in which Burton sets forth his idea that it's a kind of combination of race, sexuality, geography, all of these things. He says that there's a kind of sotadic zone, a geographical zone in which sodomy is endemic, and he calls it Le Persian vice or Le vice. And this vice is endemic in certain geographical zones. And of course, for him, the Book of 1,000 Nights and a Night emerges from out of this sotadic zone. And he obviously ran into quite a backlash for presenting uh, not just the unexpurgated tales, which have a lot of sex in them, but also these notes in which he would, talk about somebody. There's a lot of bestiality. It becomes a way for him to discuss race. So he'd talk about how people of this such and such race will be seen, having sex with a she donkey or something of that sort. Um, and and then he goes on to use the word esoteric to refer very specifically to these matters. And he says, for example, on no wise ashamed am I on lecturing upon these esoteric matters. A little later, he says that these notes, sorry, that should be notelets, the anthropological notes and notelets. They assist the student of Muslim life in a multitude of manners, and they form a repertory of Eastern knowledge in its esoteric phase, sexual as well as social. So esoteric begins to look very much like a code word. It's quite different from the way that Said was using it. Here, it's like, I suppose, since we're in the middle of the US elections, the word, dog whistle is out there. But it's kind of like making a signal that when I use the word esoteric, I'm talking about deviant sexuality. And just in case it's not clear from these quotations, I also wrote down from a letter to another translator of the Nights, John Payne. Burton is writing to him and he's saying, this is how my translation is quite different from yours. And he says, I'm going in for notes where they did not suit your scheme. And oh boy, he went in for notes, a lot of notes. And he said, these will make the book a perfect repertoire of Eastern knowledge in its most esoteric form. And we wonder, what does that mean? And he says, including the habit of the Egyptian peasantry of copulating with the crocodile, a treatise on the geographical limits of sodomy, and other excerpts from my notebook. So when he says, I'm going in for, Eastern knowledge in its most esoteric form, he specifically has in mind these sort of sexual habits that would be scandalous and exciting to his readers. And of course, you want to say, this is obviously essentialist, this is obviously racist, and, you are a sicko. And, what do you mean copulating with a crocodile, you know, speak about unsafe sex. So, so there's in no ways am I saying that, on no wise am I saying that Burton is not bringing that sort of privilege and not stamping his own stereotypical understanding of the East onto what he is allegedly just translating. But I do find it interesting that he uses the word esoteric in this way, because what it does is rather than giving all the authority to the translator, it becomes a kind of, it's a signal that needs to be decoded. And that means that it's a little bit more dynamic. Esoteric is not something which is, locked up in a particular text. It is, it's something that is a dynamic exchange um, between the translator and his reader, something that has to be picked up on. I'm so sorry, but I've just got a note that my Mac will go to sleep unless plugged into a power outlet. So if you could forgive me for a moment, maybe pause the recording and, and get a glass of water or something stronger. I'll be back in a moment. So, so if we could keep going. Thank you. We are finally now going to be talking about the Kasîdah of Haji Abdu. Okay. And you won't be able to see that facsimile reproduction of the first page. But this was always already a sort of strange text when it came out. First of all, it barely did come out because it was there were only about 200 copies printed of it, and less than 100 of those would have been available in a shop. Um, like other texts of this time, the Kasîdah of Haji Abdu al-Yazdi was available only mainly to subscribers, and this is not unusual. For example, even Burton's translations of the Arabian Nights Tales, uh, or his translation of the Kama Sutra, these were also available by subscription to a group, and it was sort of a society called the Kama Shastra Society, right? So in any case, and even with the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the most famous translation of Persian poetry from the 19th century, it first, when Edward Fitzgerald first brought out his translation of it in, I think, 1859, nobody read it, and it sort of languished until it was picked up and passed along word of mouth, and then it sort of became this publishing sensation. So, in fact, this poem seemed to be quite influenced by the Rubaiyat. Um, in any case, it's a long poem. It is about, it's almost 270 couplets. And if you were to zoom in, which I don't think you can, he translates, the translator who calls himself just FB, translates that word Kasîdah as couplets. And I'm not sure how many of you have encountered the Kasîdah. You might have heard it in some ways, because I think in India it more or less refers to a long ghazal. But it is a kind of, it's a form that's, in fact, it's in Arabic literature, it's probably older than Islam. And it has a certain kind of relationship with, scenes of desert life. It might have been the form that people recited while making those long journeys across the desert. And so we're talking about couplets, but they have some sort of relationship to, it's a kind of ode to desert existence. It then with Islam, it sort of became something where the figure of, say, the beloved began to be associated with God and so on. And this translation came with this poem, which was quite long, in 9 parts. But it also came with a lot of other stuff around it, a lot of paratextual material. So we have a note to the reader from the translator, where he talks about, he sort of gives us the main axioms of Haji Abdu's philosophy. And he also has a biographical note. In fact, he has 2 notes. One is a biographical note, and the other is a kind of note on the poem. It's a very close reading of the poem. And in that biographical note, it just says that it doesn't actually say what language this is translated from, which is a strange gap. I mean, usually you pick up something, you pick up Derrida, it says, translated from the French by Gayatri Chakrabarti Spivak. In this case, it just says translated by FB. From what? Well, maybe it's the original Oriental, because it only says that he knew Persian, which was his mother tongue, he knew Arabic, and that he wrote this manuscript in Shikasta. But of course, Nastaliq is a script that could be used for many different languages. So that's a strange silence to begin with. Vignesh, could you move on? So this begins, I'm not going to give you a whole lot from this poem because it's not the best poem ever. But I will start with the beginning, to begin with the beginning. And you'll see here that there are many ways in which it's difficult to see how this works as a translation, right? Look at the 4th line. The highlands catch yon orient gleam, while purpling still the lowlands lie. One almost feels like he's been reading Wordsworth, The Solitary Reaper, and Yon Highland Lass is, he's just taken that and mixed it up a little bit. But what you'll see is that it has something of this kind of melancholy mood, which one can also read in the Rubaiyat. And he's talking about, he begins as the Kasîdah should begin, with a scene of life in the desert. He's talking about the tents being taken down. He says, the town of canvas falls, and then he has this trope that keeps coming up, this motif of the tinkling of the camel bells, and they sort of, they're talking about the sundering approach of death. We can go on. So we have that, and then, but it's not that when you read the Rubaiyat, for example, it's talking about intoxication, it's talking about, kind of, it's striking a pose of despair. In this case, the poem keeps moving and shifting in its modes. For instance, we have this rendition of what uh, a Sufi philosophy might be. He talks about it says, I am the truth, I am the truth. We hear the God-drunk Gnostic cry. The microcosm abides in me, eternal Allah is not but I. So this idea that Sufism was, in some sense, trying to locate religion not in an institution, not out there, but within oneself. Um, and he has the figure of a Zahid who is much more traditional, who has this kind of ongoing dispute with the Sufi in the poem. If we could go on, I'll just show you a few more, just give you a little bit of a glimpse of the various kinds of references. Here we'll see that Haji Abdul al-Yazdi has a lot to say about, you know, the evolution of Homo sapiens, in a sense, because he's talking about how, in pre-Adamite days, we were brute bipeds, and, or he, man, was wearing a shaggy fell, and had, as ornaments, no earrings or anything. He just had tattooed skin and holes to hang his bits of bone, etc. And that last line on the slide, conscience was born when man had shed his fur, his tail, his pointed ears. So unlike many other poets, unlike Saadi and Hafiz, Haji Abdul has something to say about evolution, and sort of seems to be aware of Darwinian thought. Let's go on. And here's another bit of the poem where he seems to be talking almost about the conventions of, he's sort of bringing together in, in almost a pastiche form, the conventions of Persian poetry. So when we look here on the third or fourth lines, embraces cypress taper waist, smiles in the Nargis lovelorn eyes, talks about the bulbul and the rose, the gul bulbul, and toys with the daughter of the vine. And it has this beautiful cup boy, because, at this point, there's already something of a scandal around the sort of homoeroticism of Persian poetry. So bids the beauteous cup boy say, Master, I bring thee ruby wine. So this he becomes a sort of Sufi figure that he's talking about in the poem. And then he goes on to say that, my gorge arises at the thought I've had too much of it. But it's almost that, as opposed to saying, I reject this path and I'm going on to my own kind of mysticism, it's almost like I have a hangover, so I'm going on to my own kind of mysticism. And through the poem, you'll find, references to different Persian poets, as is suggested by the fact that he's bringing in these conventions of Persian poetry, but also all kinds of references to Confucius and Buddha and Odin and all kinds of figures. It's a very long poem, and it's filled with all kinds of modes, references, intertextual allusions. So we can move on, I think. And apart from that, so we had this poem, and then it is, as I said, festooned with all kinds of notes. And he talks about, he actually offers us a very close reading of the poem, this translator, FB. He offers us a reading of the poem. It's almost that he first gives the poem, which is Haji Abdul's, and then he does a reading of the poem. And he, as you remember, or you might not, but from the first sections, the selection of the poem that I offered you, there's this discussion of the wolf's tale. So he starts by, it's almost like he's paraphrasing the poem. And then he talks about what it's doing. He says that this poet is following Omar Khayyam. He's talking about the Sufis, and then he explains what the Sufis are, that there's the Sufi are those who don't believe in the letter of the law. They're the ones who read for meaning, read between the lines, and therefore they are insiders, they're esoteric readers. And moving along, please. Thank you. And then there's this kind of coy biographical note where he says, Haji Abdu has been known to me for more years than I care to record. And it says that he has his laqab, this poetic name is Al-Hitch Makani, which means of nowhere. Hitch means nothing. So Makani, I think, is he dwells nowhere. And it says, and it talks about the many languages he knew. Look at the list there: Chinese, Egyptian, Hebrew, Syriac, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Slav, Lithuanian, particularly Latin, Greek, blah 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 blah, Persian, Arabic, etc. And not only that, this amazing polymath is also someone who knows all the ologies and the triumphs of modern scientific discovery. Quite a savant. So if we move on, he at the end, almost at the very end of his second note, I think he talks about his role, and he says that here ends my share of the work. On the whole, it has been considerable, and talks about the fact that the text has nowhere been translated verbatim. In fact, a familiar European turn has been given to many sentiments which were judged too Oriental. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, we've just shown you the actual translator, as you might have, if you were a careful reader and an interested reader. The very fact that this is written by someone called Haji Abdu al-Yazdi draws attention to the fact that it is this pilgrim, right? And the initials FP for an interested reader would maybe take you back to, it's actually, I think it's Frank Baker. And Frank is related to Francis, and Baker is the maiden name of the mother of, and if we could now go to the next slide, Richard Francis Burton. So the actual, and you can see this portrait of him. And Richard Burton is quite interesting because he is somebody who, he wasn't the first European to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, but he was certainly the most celebrated, the most notorious. And he made a lot of his celebrity was based on the fact that he went into disguise. He passed as, a Persian and Afghan. He went into the bazaars of Sindh when he was posted in India, and investigated the brothels and wrote about the uses of boys in those brothels and so on. And so in one sense, as this quotation from Said tells us, Burton is one of the most, he would be an obvious contender for that authoritative translator, the person who insists, not just a translator, but somebody who can take on these different guises. And yet I'm interested in the fact that in this apocryphal translation, what happens is not just that he is making up, he keeps talking about the author, capital A, Haji Abdu. So there is a fiction, the Oriental is being produced, to go back to the first quotation from Said, but part of the fiction is also the translator. It isn't simply that it's the Orient that's being produced, but also all of the material that festoons these translations is presented to us as part of the fiction. The entire stance of authority is presented to us as part of the fiction. And so if we think of, Walter Benjamin in his analysis of translation talks about translations as having an afterlife, of retaining an afterlife or manifesting an afterlife. So there's a source text, an origin, and then the translation makes it live some more. But what's happening here is almost the opposite. It's as though the translation might be in the afterlife, but what it does is render the very idea of the origin something like a phantom. It's a spook. It didn't exist. So it's all afterlife. There is no origin at all. And I think that one could read that against the notion of the translator as authoritative figure, just as one could read Burton's usage of the word esoteric against Said's accusation about what the esotericism of the philologist might look like. And if we could just move on, I think I might be out of time, but it's just this week. I think earlier this week in my literary theory class, we were reading Barthes and Foucault about the notion of the author. And I thought that this was an interesting example of some of what Barthes and Foucault are talking about, which which would be familiar to many of you. The idea that writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, that uh, that it is the negative where all identity is lost, and that when even that rather than sort of constantly going back to the intentionality of the author, the figure of the author, what happens is that in entering into these relations, as Bart says, to dialogue, parody, contestation, and one could think about this fake translation as also being an example of dialogue, parody, and contestation, but that this is the place where the multiplicity, the place where the multiplicity is focused is that of the reader as opposed to the author. And finally, if we go forward, I just want to say that, in a sense, um, Burton himself becomes an example of, he may be translating text, but eventually he himself gets translated into being something quite other than what he began as, perhaps. And even his tomb, which you see over here, is itself a translation, an attempt to translate what is made of canvas and cloth into something that's made of stone and marble. That's the mausoleum that holds his mortal remains. That's the end of my talk, and I would be very interested in hearing any questions if you have them.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for this. We do have two questions and we're still taking questions. So if anybody has anything else, please write them to us. The first one was about how do you see the current evolving relationship between Islam and the West in literature, academic thinking, even political thinking and writing? And how would that be different from, say, what Burton is doing here?
I think that's an interesting question. I think that uh, at least the possibility of making the kind of claim that European writers, translators, etc., were making in the 19th century has been, it's entirely destabilized now. You can't, there are enough people who are writing from the point of view of Islam as practitioners, and people are, and this is not just for Islam, it's basically part of any kind of writing back to empire. So I think it's quite different, but of course we do see, the continuities in Orientalist representations in cinema, in all kinds of texts, and also in scholarship. Right? There's a lot of scholarship in America and in Europe, which still takes that same kind of approach to writing about Islam, talking about Islam as the other, seeing Islam in these stereotypical terms. So, but thank you for that question. Yeah.
The second question is about how would we read this with, or can we read this with the way in which secularism has taken over uh, reading methodologies right now? That was the second question. Can we read this case alongside secularism? Or what would it be in respect to it?
I think in some sense, the very attempt to see Sufism as not having very much to do with Islam, and in fact speaking more broadly, speaking to for a certain kind of pantheistic, heterodox sort of approach, which shows up in many of the translation choices around these works. allows us to critique the claim to secularism in a way. Um, and uh, and actually this goes back to your first first question that came up, because if you look at, for instance, the way that Rumi is read these days, right? Everyone, well, not everybody, but you'll find that people are always quoting Rumi. There are all kinds of, he pops up in, new age writings in the middle of a film, etc. Celebrities quote Rumi, and when you read these translations, they're often doing away with any kind of link to Islam, whereas it's sort of like secularizing Rumi as a way of uh, rescuing Rumi into a sort of universalism. So thinking about that critically, I think, allows us to question secularism in one way. At the same time, I want to also, I mean, I value secularism. I don't want to make it into a bad word or anything, but I think that the way that we see somebody like Burton kind of, although he was 100% a racist in all kinds of ways, at the same time, when we see him revel in the pleasure of imposture, of, maybe saying that actually I was, in Sindh, I was initiated as a Sufi and I'm now an expert, I'm a murshid, um, or, boastfully sort of making a lot of, it's sort of basing his success on the fact that he was able to travel in disguise to Mecca. I think that these kinds of attempts to let go of one identity to inhabit others, the attempt to find out more about different religions, um, is something that leads to new ways, new representations of the self, new explorations of the self. And that, I think, is quite interesting. It sort of allows us to think about differences in a new way.
The next question was, wasn't there something sketchy about William Jones's translations? I vaguely remember a claim, this is Professor Yusuf, I vaguely remember a claim that he misrepresented translations as his own poetry or his own poetry as translation.
I don't know. I actually, I want to say that uh, to Professor Yusuf, that as soon as I saw, uh, I heard the word sketchy, Sharif, I knew it was your question. But I think, I don't know that. I think that there are certain translations. I've actually looked at translations in which he's obviously fighting off certain meanings that might be suggesting themselves to him. But I don't know enough about whether it was, he was also guilty of completely apocryphal sort of translation.
And there's another question, and that's, in what way are the definitions of esoteric different in Said and Burton? I mean, how do you see the difference between?
I think I see it in the way that for Burton, there's a kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink quality to it, right? When he says, he's using it euphemistically, so it stands for a particular thing. And when you consider the idea that a word stands for a very particular meaning, that seems to argue for fixity, right? That seems to be going against our enjoyment of language as being slippery and plural. But at the same time, there's a kind of slipperiness in that, because this meaning can only be understood if as part of a dynamic exchange. It is not claiming that this is an authoritative meaning. So it does away with this idea of, I suppose it makes it less of a noun and more of a verb. Esotericism isn't something, a quality isn't something that is a secret that has to be prized open. It is more, a part of an activity of reading, of meaning making, which sees that meaning. It sort of is aware that meaning is constructed and contingent and relational.
Thank you, Professor. This is from Professor Roy. Right at the end of a slightly unrelated query, she says, but I thought it was wonderful. Right at the end, you drew a binary between canvas and stone in relation to Burton. Why that? What is that? What is the significance there?
I think I find this this kind of mausoleum, both uh, kitschy and touching in a way. So I find this the idea that Burton is being memorialized in this way as the great pilgrim. Um, so there's a sense of incongruity in that, which is I think what I wanted to draw attention to when I was talking about the translation uh, of canvas to stone. That there's a wishfulness there, and it doesn't quite work. But at the same time, it does work. You can sort of see the folds of cloth, uh, at least somewhat represented in the stone. Um, I just was enjoying the materiality of it. So maybe it's that.
The next question, and I think we have time for a couple more questions. The next question was about how are the senses alluded to in representing the Oriental, and how important is the nature of sensory in Sufi poetry? Does the aesthetic sensory add to the ornamental or exoticism of the poems, or is it more deeply rooted in representing religion? So the allusion to the senses or the sensory imagery in the is it to do with the orientalizing feature, or is it deeply rooted in Sufi thought? I think that's the question from what I can.
Yeah, that question is a version of asking whether something is Sufi or whether it's only part of the representations, I think. And uh, I believe that there is quite a lot of, I mean, as with poetry, lots of different kinds of poetry, of course, there's a lot of sensuality in this. And if you, at least as far as I can tell, because I'm only reading translations, but certainly when people listen to ghazals, for example, they're enjoying or read them, they're enjoying the sensuality of the language, the imagery, and so on. But I don't think that this is necessarily tied to this is something to do with poetry and language as much as it is to do with a particular culture. And what happened was that as in the 18th and 19th century, as people encountered these poems, it sort of led to an understanding of Islam as being kind of licentious, which was already present with the idea that, which was itself scandalous, the idea that uh, men could have many wives and so on. There's a sense of carnality that was attached to Islam to begin with. And over the sort of course of the 18th century, this gets distilled into something more like the sentimental, the orgiastic, gets replaced by the sentimental in a way. Um, I think that it is certainly one of the reasons why there was a wildly appreciative audience for these poems in late Victorian England. And when you look at the reception of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, for example, which was picked up by, you know, particularly maybe 20 years after it was written, people who would be, who became part of the sort of aestheticist movement were almost produced as a milieu by the reading of this text. So the, you don't even have to read the Rubaiyat. You could even read, say, Oscar Wilde, and you read something like the story, the Nightingale and the Rose, that the sort of fairy tale that he comes up with, and he's taking the Nightingale and the Rose, these elements from Persian poetry and translation, and he gives it this completely new context. But he retains that sense of sentimentality, the sense of transport, and it becomes a way of thinking about dissident ways of being. So I don't know. That's a long answer to your question. Yeah.
I think that there are so many questions, but I can only take one more because of the time. And this is what finally does Burton and the Kasîdah represent? Then where do you see it? I think, and I'm asking this question because it relates to many other questions that have come. One of the questions is about how helpful is the diet of Oriental and Occidental when we are thinking of, I mean, here there's something about authority and language and translation that's happening. And how helpful is it to think about Orientalism here? So there's that question too. And so I wanted to ask this bigger umbrella question. What does Burton and the Kasîdah represent?
To me, I think Burton and the Kasîdah represents a way of considering that claim to mastery within Orientalism anew, which, it's sort of like it's showing its underpinnings. It is not, you can't really, it doesn't manage to cover up and retain that posture of mastery. It doesn't manage to, and thinking about it, the fact that both Frank Baker and Haji Abdu are as fictitious as one another. We return to that first quotation of Said, with which I began the presentation. It's not just the Orient that's being created. The Orient is creating the Occident right back, in a sense, or the Occident, in creating the Orient, is also creating itself. And you can sort of see the mechanism of that at work when you read the Kasîdah. I also think it's just an interesting text. It's not a beautiful poem by any means, but it is one that is very much, an artifact of its times. And people like Burton, people who are playing with identity in this fashion, I think that colonial history is full of characters like this. And to attend to that becomes a way of understanding how the colonial relationship actually plays out in reality, or in whatever we can access of reality.
Thank you, Professor. That was very illuminating. And thank you all for attending on a Saturday night. I'm very happy to see the participation we had today. We'll send you notifications about the rest of the Milans. And thank you once again, Professor Dubey. This was fantastic.
Thank you very much, Vignesh, and thank you all. And thank you also to all the people who sent in questions. So, thanks.